That's the mail-order bride?
Too ugly for any man here.
The stagecoach rattled to a halt in the center of a sun-bleached town that seemed half asleep under the pitiless weight of the afternoon. Dust hung in the air like smoke, stirred by the horses' restless stamping, and all along the boardwalks faces appeared, lean men in battered hats, women with aprons stiff from washwater, children peering out from behind their mother skirts. From that carriage stepped a woman, and the crowd grew still for a heartbeat. She was the mail-order bride, the one summoned by a promise inked on paper, by hope carried across miles. And yet when her boots touched the cracked earth of the street, the whispers began. She's too ugly. Lord, look at her. Poor fool of a man that sent for her. The words fell like stones, heavy, cutting, meant to bruise. She heard them all, every mutter, every laugh buried in a cough, every sneer curling from the corners of mouths. Her back stiffened though her chest ached with shame. She kept walking, the sun beating mercilessly down on her bonnet, dust rising to cling to her hem. She carried herself as if she could not hear, but inside, a fire smoldered against the insult, against the scorn of those who had not seen the miles she walked, the hunger she endured, the bargain of survival that had pushed her into another man's claim. They stared at her with the cruelty of the frontier, where women were often weighed like livestock, beauty a currency as valuable as coin. And yet she walked, step after step, past the saloon's shadowed doors and the smithy's open maw of fire. Her face was plain, her features too sharp, her figure too thin from years of deprivation. But her eyes, though downcast, burned with a stubborn glint, a flame not yet snuffed out. By evening, the town had judged her. In the saloon, men leaned back in chairs and laughed, telling each other that no man would claim such a bride. Women whispered over their washing lines that perhaps she'd been cursed, or born wrong in God's eyes. Even the hotel clerk, a man paid to show courtesy for coin, hesitated as she placed her few belongings on the counter. His mouth twisted as though he'd been handed a bad bill. With a sigh too loud to be anything but deliberate, he slid the key across to her, muttering, "Room in the back. Don't expect much." She carried the key as if it weighed 100 pounds. Children pointed, mothers pulled them close, as though ugliness might be a sickness that clung to her skirts. A pair of cowhands laughed outright when she passed, one elbowing the other, saying, "That one won't even tempt the hungriest men." She felt their eyes cut through her like knives, but she said nothing. Her lips pressed tight against the words she longed to cry aloud, that she was human, that her heart beat, that she had come here for hope, not mockery. Instead, she held it all inside, whispering her prayers in silence, asking the Lord not for beauty, but for a place where she might be seen as more than the shell of her face. The room she was given smelled of mildew and old wood, the window nailed shut, the wallpaper peeling like tired skin. She sat on the narrow bed and at last let her shoulders shake. No sound escaped her lips, for she would not give them the satisfaction of hearing her broken. She wept into her hands, silently, fiercely, until the tears dried and the desert wind outside rattled against the frame. Sleep did not come easy. In the darkness, she remembered a life she had left behind. The dirt floor of her family's shack, the endless hunger that gnawed at her ribs, the way her father signed her name to a letter as if she were cattle to be traded. Her mother's eyes, hollow with guilt, could not meet hers. She had thought marriage, even to a stranger, would mean salvation, maybe even kindness. But here she was, bartered away to a land that spit on her at first glance. And yet, she clung to hope. She wrapped it around herself like a thin shawl, barely enough to keep out the cold. Somewhere in this barren country, she told herself, there must be one soul who would not see her as the town saw her. Perhaps that was foolishness. Perhaps it was all she had left. The next day, as she stepped outside, the town barely noticed her. Whispers had moved on to other matters. She wandered to the edge of the street where the ground sloped downward toward a structure crouched in its own glow. It was the blacksmith's forge, half hidden in the glare of the sun, firelight sparking against the anvil, ringing out with the steady rhythm of hammer on steel. The sound carried, strong and sure, a heartbeat in the stillness of the frontier. There he was, the men she had heard about in stray rumors, broad shoulders bent over iron, face shadowed with soot, eyes fixed on the molten heart of his work. They said he was reclusive, speaking little, keeping to himself on the far side of town. They said he had been broken by something in his past, though no one knew the shape of it. She watched him for a moment, unnoticed, the hammer rising and falling, each strike sending sparks into the air. The glow lit the sweat on his brow, the muscles in his arms, the stubborn strength of a man who lived in the silence of his own company. And then, as though he had felt her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes met across the haze of heat and smoke. For the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, she did not see mockery in another's eyes. She did not see scorn, or laughter, or pity. He regarded her with the quiet steadiness of a man who judged not by appearance but by something deeper, something forged like the iron beneath his hammer. His silence was not rejection. It was recognition. She lowered her gaze, suddenly unsteady beneath that look, but a spark flickered within her chest, fragile yet real. Perhaps, she thought, her worth had not been swallowed by dust and cruelty. Perhaps in this place of fire and iron, someone had noticed what others refused to see. The clang of iron rang out over the dust, steady as a heartbeat, and she found herself moving toward it almost without thought. The forge glowed at the edge of town, a stubborn flame in a place that otherwise seemed intent on swallowing her whole. Smoke curled into the sky, sparks leapt like fireflies, and the men at the anvil worked with the patient strength of one who had nothing left but his craft. She lingered a few steps away, unsure she should turn back, but something in that rhythm held her. He looked up, his eyes catching hers. They were not soft eyes, nor harsh ones. They carried no sneer, no pity, only a kind of calm that felt almost unbearable after the cruelty she had endured. He studied her as if she were a problem to be solved, not a blemish to be scorned. "You look thirsty," he said simply, his voice roughened by smoke and solitude. He reached for a tin cup, filled it from a bucket, and set it within her reach. Her hands trembled as she took it. The water was warm, metallic, yet sweeter than anything she had tasted in days. The kindness of the gesture startled her more than the taste itself. She kept her gaze lowered, afraid of finding ridicule in his eyes once more, but when she dared a glance, he was already back at his work, hammering with that same steady rhythm. "You've no reason to be kind," she murmured, almost to herself. He didn't stop. The sparks flew. No reason not to. For the first time since she had set foot in the town, her chest eased enough for her to breathe. She lingered there in the glow of the forge, as though the fire itself shielded her from the voices that had cut her down. When she came again the next evening, she found him at the anvil once more, the fire reflecting in his dark eyes. This time he spoke without her prompting. "I have no family, no one to share the years with. Only this." He gestured toward the forge, the iron, the smoke that clung to his clothes like a second skin. She hesitated, the words tangled on her tongue. "Why tell me this?" He met her gaze, his expression plain, without flourish or gentleness. "Because they'll not have you. I will." The words fell between them like a hammer stroke, simple, undeniable. She gasped as though he had struck the wind from her. For a moment she searched his face for mockery, for the cruel spark of a joke, but she found none. His voice carried no derision, only the blunt truth of a man who said little but meant what he spoke. Tears stung her eyes, hot and unbidden. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said. "You're alone. So am I." He lifted another piece of iron, glowing from the heat, and placed it on the anvil. "That's all that matters." In that moment, beneath the blaze of firelight, she felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been knotted tight for years. He wasn't blind to her face, nor did he pretend otherwise. He simply didn't care. And in that rough honesty, she began to believe, for the first time, that she was not worthless. Word spread fast through the town. The blacksmith had claimed a bride they called too ugly. By morning, it was on every tongue, from the saloon to the mercantile. "Lonely fool," someone muttered, loud enough for her to hear. "A man so desperate, he'd take anything," another snorted. Laughter rolled over her like the desert wind, but this time she did not walk alone. At her side, the blacksmith strode with the steady gait of one who did not care for the world's judgment. When the cowhands jeered, he said nothing, only hammered harder at the forge until the ring of steel drowned them out. His silence was heavier than their cruelty, his defiance stronger than their ridicule. She stood beside him, trembling at first, but when his hand brushed against hers, a quiet strength settled over her. His steadiness became her shield, and for once she dared to lift her chin against the stares of the townsfolk. Days slipped into weeks, and in his cabin on the edge of the desert, their bond grew in the quiet ways that matter more than grand declarations. She cooked over the small hearth, patching what little they had, finding solace in the order she could create. He returned each night with smoke on his skin and iron dust in his beard, and though he said little, The simple presence of him filled the cabin with more warmth than she had ever known. Sometimes, when the day cooled into evening, he would lead her outside, pointing toward a patch of stubborn wildflowers that had forced themselves through the dry soil. "See that," he'd say. "Desert don't forgive weakness. Those live because they won't die." She looked at the flowers, at their fragile stalks trembling in the wind, and felt a reflection of herself in them. Ugly perhaps, overlooked always, but still alive. At the forge, he let her watch as he shaped iron into tools, into things that mattered. "Fire don't destroy," he told her once. "Not if you know how to use it. It tempers, makes weak iron strong." She thought of her own life, of the cruel laughter of the town, of the shame that had clung to her like dust. She thought of the tears shed in silence, the hunger endured, the rejection suffered. Perhaps she, too, had been tempered by fire. Slowly, she began to see herself through his eyes. Not beautiful in the way the town measured beauty, but worthy in the way the desert measured survival. Each day she stood a little straighter, her shame turning into something harder, sharper, forged alongside him in iron and dust. The town could whisper what it liked. She had found her place, in the firelight of a lonely blacksmith's forge, in the silence of his strength, in the rough honesty that had pulled her from the ashes of despair. And with every passing day, she felt herself becoming something new, not the bride they called too ugly, but the woman who had been claimed by men who saw her as she was, and found her enough. The morning broke hot and cruel, the sun spilling over the ridges like fire poured onto stone. The town was already stirring uneasily when the sound came, a low thunder of hooves rolling in from the canyon. Men straightened on the boardwalks, mothers pulled their children inside, and shutters snapped shut. A gang of riders swept into the street, dust rising in their wake, their laughter sharp and ugly. They dismounted with the swagger of wolves circling sheep, rifles and pistols glinting beneath the harsh light. "Bring us your coin," the leader barked, his voice carrying like a whip crack. "Bring it now, or we'll take more than gold." His men shoved townsfolk aside, overturning barrels, kicking in doors. The saloon door slammed open as bottles shattered against the wall. Fear spread fast, the same men who once jeered at the bride now crouching low, their eyes wide, their courage drained. From the edge of the street came the ring of iron on iron, one sound that refused to bend to the gang's chaos. The blacksmith stepped forward, shoulders squared, soot still smudged across his jaw. At his side was the woman they had once scorned, her bonnet shadowing her eyes but her back unbowed. Together they stewed in the dust while the rest of the town cowered. The gang leader sneered when he saw them. "And what's this? The lonely smith and his scarecrow bride." His men roared with laughter, cruel and sharp. But she did not flinch. Her hand brushed against the blacksmith's arm, steadying herself as much as him, and she lifted her chin. She was no longer the frightened girl stepping from a stagecoach, wilted beneath their jeers. She stood as if the fire from his forge had passed into her blood, fierce and unafraid. Her loyalty to the men beside her was ironbound, her spirit unshakable. The leader circled closer, his grin wide and wolfish. "Ugly as a coyote and twice as worthless. What's it like, Smith? Hammering all day, then coming home to that?" The word struck the crowd with fresh laughter, but she stepped forward, her voice carrying like steel drawn from the sheath. "I've lived with worse devils than you." The laughter died as sudden as a gunshot. The gang shifted uneasily, not from fear of her strength but from the force in her voice, the conviction that rolled from her like a storm. She had no pistol, no blade, yet in that moment she was armed with the truth of every cruelty she had endured and survived. "You think your threats will break me," she went on, her voice rising. "I was bartered away by those who should have loved me. I starved through winters that killed better folk than you. I walked into this town and heard laughter sharp as knives, but I am still standing. You've nothing new to give me, nothing I haven't already beaten." The blacksmith looked at her then, truly looked, and something fierce lit behind his eyes. For all his strength, for all the iron he could bend, he had never seen a fire like the one burning in her now. His hammer hand tightened on the haft of his tool, and he stepped forward until he stood between her and the gang. "Leave," he said, voice steady as stone. The gang laughed again, but there was unease now, rippling like wind over dry grass. The leader spat in the dust, but his eyes flicked between the smith's solid frame and the bride's unflinching stare. Still, he drew his pistol, if only to prove to himself he was not afraid. The moment stretched taut. The blacksmith's hammer rose, iron glinting in the sun. His arm swung with the strength of a lifetime, striking the pistol clean from the man's hand, sending it skittering across the dirt. Chaos erupted, shouts, the cock of rifles, but the townsfolk, stirred by something raw and unexpected, surged forward behind the pair. Men who had hidden now grabbed shovels, broomsticks, anything they could wield. Women pulled their children close and shouted for the outlaws to leave. The gang fired a shot into the air, but the carriage of the town had shifted, emboldened by the defiance of one man and one woman. The blacksmith drove his hammer into the ground, sending a thundering ring across the street, a challenge no outlaw could mistake. The bride stood beside him, her eyes never leaving the leader, daring him to try again. Faced with resistance they had not expected, the gang mounted up, spitting curses as they retreated down the road. Dust swallowed them as quickly as they had come, their threats echoing back over the ridge. Silence fell. The townsfolk stared, breathless, at the pair who remained standing in the street. The blacksmith's chest heaved with the weight of battle averted, but it was the bride who drew every gaze. Her face was flushed, her hair wild from the wind, but her eyes burned with a light that none could deny. No one dared whisper "too ugly" now. The words felt small, hollow, against what they had witnessed. Where they had seen weakness, they now saw steel. Where they had once laughed, they now watched in awe. That night, as the forge glowed again and the hammer rang against the anvil, the town spoke in hushed tones. They spoke of the blacksmith's strength, yes, but more so of the woman who had stood before outlaws and spat defiance into their teeth. Her courage had struck deeper than any weapon, her spirit more unyielding than any iron. From then on, she was no longer just a mail-order bride, nor the one mocked as too plain, too ugly. She was the blacksmith's bride, the woman who had stood when others trembled, who had given voice to every soul too afraid to speak. Her story traveled farther than the town itself, carried on the tongues of drifters, passed along by firelight in saloons and campgrounds. They mocked her, the tale always began, until she stood beside a man who saw her worth, and together, they taught a town that beauty lies not in the face, but in the fire of the soul. And so she lived, no longer weighed down by shame, but lifted by the legend she had become. The desert, the dust, the cruel laughter of the world, none of it mattered anymore. She had been tempered by fire, made stronger than iron, her life bound forever to the men who claimed her not for beauty, but for truth. And in that truth, she had become unforgettable.